Eddie Morales had never considered himself a bad man. Not really. Not in the way stories usually define villains. He didn't steal. He didn't lie, not outright, anyway. He paid his taxes, though sometimes late. He recycled. He smiled at strangers, tipped at restaurants. But the truth was, Eddie Morales had one great flaw: he believed deeply, almost religiously, that the world owed him something. And when his mother died and left him her old house in South Sacramento, a cracked two-bedroom with peeling paint, a front lawn overtaken by crabgrass, and a half-collapsed fence, he saw it not as a final memory of her life, but as repayment. For his patience. For his quiet suffering. For the years he worked jobs he hated and watched others pass him by. It was his turn, finally. His reward. He moved nothing. Left the boxes of old magazines stacked against the walls, the dust-covered furniture, the faded plastic flowers in the kitchen window. He didn't want to live there. It wasn't that kind of inheritance. Eddie already had his apartment, modest but functional, 2 blocks from his job at the insurance office. The house, in his mind, was a tool. And like all tools, it had a purpose: income. Passive income, to be specific. Money that would come to him without effort. The American dream in its rawest form. Within 2 weeks, Eddie had listed the property for rent on multiple sites. He didn't go through a realtor. Why would he? That would mean sharing a cut. No, he took the pictures himself, carefully avoiding the water stains on the ceiling and the cracked tile near the bathroom. He wrote the listing to sound charming, rustic even, classic family home with character. Spacious yard. Great light. Perfect for young families or working couples. He got dozens of messages within days, most of them desperate. People asking if pets were allowed, if they could pay in installments, if he could hold it just one more week. He didn't answer those. Desperation wasn't attractive unless it came with money. But one message stood out. It was polite, concise, and included proof of income: Sarah Bennett, a teacher, and her husband, Tom, who worked in construction. They had a baby. They needed a new place after their previous rental was sold. Sarah's message ended with, "We're quiet, responsible, and always pay on time." Eddie responded quickly. He arranged a showing, and when the Bennetts arrived, young, clearly exhausted but trying to look composed, he greeted them with rehearsed warmth. He showed them the living room, the outdated kitchen, the tiny backyard littered with dry leaves and a rusted swing set. "It needs a little love," Sarah said gently, looking around. "But it's got good bones," Tom added. Eddie nodded. "Exactly. You two could really make it a home." They signed the lease that evening. Eddie had written it himself. It was 13 pages long and filled with clauses that favored him. Rent could increase at any time with a 30-day notice, all repairs, regardless of origin, were the tenant's responsibility, eviction could be initiated after a single late payment. He didn't explain these details. Sarah skimmed it. Tom barely looked. They needed a home, and this was the best they could afford. By the time they moved in, Eddie had already started imagining what he'd do with the extra income: pay down his credit card, maybe buy a new phone, upgrade his TV. He felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. Power, perhaps. Control. The first month went smoothly. Rent was deposited on time. The baby, whom Eddie never saw but often heard crying during visits, seemed to settle. But by the second month, Eddie got a text from Sarah. "There's a leak under the kitchen sink. It's starting to smell. Can you send someone?" Eddie didn't answer immediately. He waited 2 days, then replied, "Per lease, tenant handles repairs. Let me know when it's fixed." Sarah replied, "We're happy to take care of minor things, but this seems serious. There's water damage." He left that one unanswered. Within weeks, there were more messages. Mold in the bathroom. A broken heater. Ants. Sarah's tone remained polite but increasingly strained. Tom tried calling once, and Eddie let it go to voicemail. He didn't have time for hand-holding. They had signed the lease. Everything was legal. In month 4, Eddie raised the rent. Not by much, just $50. But it felt good. It felt like he was growing as a landlord. He told his co-workers about it over lunch. "You'd be surprised how easy it is," he said, chewing on a turkey sandwich. "People complain about property management, but it's just business. They pay, you collect. Simple." By month 6, Sarah was documenting everything. She had begun taking photos, saving texts, and recording phone calls. One night, she left Eddie a voicemail. Her voice trembled. "Our baby's been sick. We took him to urgent care last week. The doctor thinks the mold might be the cause. Please, Eddie. We need help." He deleted it. By month 8, Tom had lost his job. Construction work had dried up, and he was struggling to find new gigs. Sarah took on more tutoring hours, teaching kids online late into the night. The baby cried more. The walls, quite literally, were crumbling. When they finally missed a rent payment, by 6 days, Eddie served them an eviction notice. He printed it at work, folded it neatly, and delivered it himself. Sarah opened the door, dark circles under her eyes, holding her child. She didn't yell. Didn't cry. Just nodded and closed the door. They left 2 weeks later. Eddie didn't say goodbye. Didn't ask where they were going. He changed the locks and relisted the property the same day. The next tenants weren't like the Bennetts. 3 men in their 20s. Paid cash up front. Didn't ask questions. Eddie didn't offer a lease this time. It felt like a win. But within a month, the neighbors were complaining. Loud music. Strange smells. Nora, the retired librarian next door, called the police twice. When officers raided the house, they found signs of drug manufacturing. Holes punched through the walls. Broken windows. Smashed appliances. The house was condemned. Eddie was fined. He owed for hazardous waste removal, electrical rewiring, structural damage. His insurance didn't cover any of it. The income he had once bragged about vanished overnight. Sarah's video surfaced a week later. She had posted it anonymously, photos, documents, voice recordings. "Our landlord ignored mold that made our baby sick." It gained traction. Then went viral. News outlets picked it up. Eddie's name trended on local Twitter. Someone spray-painted "Slumlord" on his apartment door. He lost his job 3 months later. Too many calls. Too much attention. He couldn't afford rent. Couldn't afford repairs. Couldn't afford silence. By winter, Eddie Morales was sleeping in his car, parked across from the house that was supposed to save him. The windows were boarded up. The lawn, overgrown. The swing set still there, still rusted. Sometimes, Nora would pass by. She wouldn't wave. Wouldn't speak. Just nod, slightly. He wondered if Sarah ever drove by. If she saw what became of him. But karma doesn't leave voicemails. Karma doesn't knock. It settles in like mold. Silent. Spreading. Unforgiving. And Eddie? Eddie learned that the rent was never free. Not even for him. Winter was cruel that year. Colder than Eddie remembered. He bundled himself in an old jacket that didn't quite zip, slept curled in the back seat of his Honda Civic with a blanket that still smelled faintly of his mother's house. He parked a few blocks from the condemned property, where he could still see the silhouette of the rusted swing set through foggy windows. Each morning, he brushed his teeth at a nearby gas station, used their bathroom sink to wash his face, and bought a coffee he couldn't afford just to justify being there. Eddie told himself this was temporary. A rough patch. Something he'd recover from. But weeks passed. Then months. The car became a second skin. He avoided old friends, ignored calls from debt collectors, and scrolled through job listings on a phone that barely held a charge. He applied to everything: insurance, sales, janitorial work. No one called back. Meanwhile, Sarah's video continued spreading. It was shared on tenant rights pages, picked up by podcasts, even quoted in a local city council meeting. Her voice, calm and unwavering, told the story of what had happened in Eddie's house. She didn't name him directly, but the address was visible in one clip. Eddie's face, once barely known beyond his office, became a symbol. A warning. Some nights, he couldn't sleep. Not from the cold, but from the noise in his mind. He replayed it all, every message he ignored, every clause in the lease, every small choice he made that had felt so justified at the time. He wondered how different things might have been if he had just fixed the leak. Answered the call. Apologized. But regret, like mold, spreads slowly and clings deep. One evening in late February, Eddie saw Nora again. She was walking her dog, same route as always. She stopped near his car and stared at the house. The boards on the windows had started to rot. The lawn had swallowed the walkway. Eddie rolled down his window halfway. "It's a shame," she said, not looking at him. "Used to be a good house. Before you let it rot." He didn't reply. He didn't have the strength. She glanced at him briefly. "You're still breathing. That means you can still change. If you want to." He wanted to scoff. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there long after she walked away, staring at the outline of the porch light that hadn't turned on in over a year. In March, he found a flyer pinned to the community board at the gas station: Tenant Advocacy Workshop, learn your rights, share your story. The photo beneath it showed Sarah, holding a microphone, standing in front of a crowded room. Eddie tore the flyer down. But he didn't throw it away. He folded it and kept it in the glove compartment, beside the worn copy of the lease agreement he had written all those months ago. Spring arrived like a whisper: soft winds, longer days, buds on trees that lined the quieter side streets of Sacramento. The warmth did little to improve Eddie's situation, but it made sleeping in the car slightly more bearable. He no longer woke up shivering, though hunger had started replacing the cold as his most consistent discomfort. His savings were gone. His credit cards maxed. Each morning he counted change for gas or a muffin. Some days, he skipped breakfast entirely. Still, he found himself more awake. More aware. He noticed the world in ways he hadn't before. Watched the sunrise through the car windshield, studied the movement of people from afar, and felt a strange stillness settle over him. For the first time in a long while, he had nothing to manage, no schedule to follow, no emails to respond to. There was, oddly, peace in the ruin. One morning, while parked behind a laundromat, he saw a man unloading trash bags full of clothes. Eddie watched him for several minutes, wiry frame, maybe mid-20s, moving with focus. Eventually, the man looked up and caught his gaze. "You sleeping in that thing?" the man asked, gesturing to Eddie's Civic. Eddie nodded. He didn't bother lying anymore. "Been there," the man said. "Name's Marcus. I've got a couch if you're tired of that seat. No strings. Just one night. You look rough." Eddie hesitated. It had been months since anyone offered him anything without expecting something in return. He followed Marcus later that evening, just a few blocks, to a cramped studio above an auto parts store. It smelled like cigarettes and ramen. The furniture was a mix of thrift store finds and hand-me-downs. Still, the couch was soft, the air warm, and the silence comfortable. They didn't talk much. But Marcus left out an extra blanket and let Eddie shower. He hadn't done that in weeks. As the water ran down his back, Eddie felt layers of his past dissolve down the drain, oil from parking lot sleep, sweat from panic, invisible shame that clung to his skin. That night, Eddie slept hard. Dreamless. He woke to the sound of coffee being made and a local news anchor talking about a tenant rights protest downtown. Sarah's name was mentioned. Eddie froze. "You know her?" Marcus asked. Eddie didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "Yeah. I used to." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You look like a guy who's seen both sides." Eddie didn't argue. Later that week, Marcus brought home a flyer, same workshop Eddie had seen in March. "They're looking for volunteers," he said, holding it out. "They don't ask questions. Just help with setup, check-ins, stuff like that." Eddie took it. This time, he didn't fold it. He didn't stash it in a drawer. He laid it on the couch beside him and stared at it for a long time. He wasn't sure why. He just knew something inside him was shifting. Maybe not redemption, but motion. The workshop was held in a community center painted light blue, with cracked linoleum floors and folding chairs that creaked with every shift of weight. Eddie arrived early, heart pounding, hands shoved into the pockets of a borrowed jacket. He didn't register as a volunteer. He didn't say a word. He just stood in the back, watching as people filtered in, young couples, mothers with strollers, older men with worn hats and weary eyes. People who had been displaced, taken advantage of, lied to. He listened. He listened as one man described being evicted after reporting rats in the walls. Another woman said her landlord had sold the property without notice and left her scrambling to find shelter for her 3 kids. A teenage girl talked about sleeping on couches after her family's apartment was condemned. And then Sarah spoke. She stood in front of the crowd, not with anger, but with calm resolve. She talked about mold, and how it took weeks before anyone believed her. How it felt to choose between rent and medicine. How helpless she felt when her baby struggled to breathe. She didn't mention Eddie. Not by name. But her story sat heavy in the air. Eddie stood motionless in the back. Every word felt like a stone pressed to his chest. He realized he had never truly heard her voice before, not like this. Not when it mattered. After the session ended, people mingled, exchanged information, laughed even. Eddie turned to leave, but a hand stopped him. "Marcus. Glad you came," he said. Eddie nodded. "I didn't do anything." "You listened," Marcus said. "That's more than most." That night, Eddie asked if he could stay one more week. Just to figure things out. Marcus shrugged. "You don't owe me anything. But maybe you should start figuring out what you owe other people." The next morning, Eddie made coffee while Marcus slept. He washed the mugs. He folded his blanket. He stared at the flyer still tacked to the fridge. And he started writing. Not an apology, not yet. But notes. Memories. Contracts. Clauses. A record of everything he had done, and every consequence that had followed. He didn't know who it was for. Maybe Sarah. Maybe himself. The house was still his. Legally. Though the fines had piled up and it would take thousands to make it livable again. But for the first time, Eddie didn't think of the house as income. He thought of it as responsibility. He returned that afternoon. Walked the overgrown path. Climbed the porch steps. The lock had been broken during the last raid, so the door creaked open without resistance. Inside, the air was stale with rot. Floorboards were warped. Cabinets torn off their hinges. In one corner, someone had spray-painted a curse. Eddie stood there for a long time. Then he opened every window. The scent of rot and mildew clung to Eddie's clothes long after he left the house. He tried scrubbing it out at Marcus's place, washing his jacket in the sink with dish soap, but the smell was more than just physical, it was symbolic. It was what he carried. What he'd made. What he'd ignored for too long. The next morning, Eddie visited the city office. He took a number. He waited in a plastic chair under flickering fluorescent lights for nearly an hour before a clerk called his name. She looked at him like she'd seen 100 men just like him, half excuses, half regret. He handed over the citation paperwork. "I want to settle my debt," he said. His voice cracked on "settle," as if the word had weight beyond money. She scanned the files. "You're looking at $17,000 in repairs, unpaid fines, and back taxes." She said it flatly, like ordering a sandwich. Eddie didn't blink. "Where do I start?" It took over an hour of paperwork, signatures, and hesitant calculations. They offered him a rehabilitation program. He'd have to submit a restoration plan, agree to inspections, and meet deadlines. There were grants, if he qualified. He didn't. But the paperwork stayed in his hands as he walked out. Outside, the air was clearer than he remembered. Back at Marcus's apartment, he sat at the table, papers spread out, tracing deadlines with his finger. He wasn't sure why. He had no tools. No contractors. No savings. But something about holding those papers made the consequences real. Made the damage real. And maybe, just maybe, made the solution feel possible. That night, Marcus found him asleep on the table, his head resting on blueprints of a broken house. Over the next week, Eddie walked. Miles and miles. He passed through parts of Sacramento he used to drive by without thought. He saw the tents tucked under overpasses, the sleeping bags near dumpsters, the quiet lines outside churches serving hot meals. He talked to no one. But he listened. Observed. Counted faces. He started recognizing people, not by name, but by ritual. The man with the orange coat who always ate in silence. The woman who wore headphones with no music. Every face reminded him of someone he had displaced. A renter. A phone call he ignored. A sigh he dismissed. One day, on impulse, Eddie went into a hardware store. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe just something to hold. Something he could fix, unlike everything else. He wandered down the aisles, brushing his fingers along the shelves of nails, paint, tools. An employee approached. "Need help finding something?" Eddie almost said no. Then he paused. "Yeah," he said. "I need to fix a house I broke." The kid smiled, awkward. "We've got a lot of tools for that." Eddie bought sandpaper, gloves, and a face mask. It wasn't much. But it was a start.